You know, whatever it is.
Hello and welcome. You're watching the top Jewish news channel. My name is Michael Wilensky, and my guest today is David Wu, former IMF economist and a CEO of an investment advisement firm. David, great to have you.
Thank you for having me.
David, so you were called by the Business Insider as one of the 12 smartest people on Wall Street, right? And you are a foreigner living in Israel. You lived through the war that we're all going through since the 7th of October. First and foremost, I want to ask you, how was it like being a foreigner in Israel during this war?
Yeah, I think, it was amazing, actually. As a foreigner, I sort of felt like I was seeing Israel for the first time. I mean, even though I've been coming to Israel for 30-something years, I love this country, but nevertheless, the war was a wake-up call. I think in some sense was perhaps even a bigger wake-up call, I think, for Israelis. But as a foreigner, in many ways, I wasn't completely surprised. Okay, and I think this is what I want to talk about today. Why I think October 7th, to some extent, it happened, it was tragic, but it wasn't too big of a surprise either. Okay, so let's think a little bit about this, right? Because in my view, if you think about this, in the weeks leading up to October 7th, we had the Biden administration basically, trying very hard to get Israel and Saudi Arabia to agree on a deal, on a three-way deal, that will normalize relationship between Saudi Arabia and Israel, but in exchange for Israel recognizing, some kind of, future Palestinian state, whatever it is, okay? But that in itself was interesting because you said, well, but why did Biden try to orchestrate this deal between U.S., Israel, and Saudi Arabia? The reason is actually pretty obvious. It's interesting because 3 months earlier, the Chinese had mediated an agreement between Saudi Arabia and Iran. All of a sudden, the U.S. felt cut off from basically the Middle East. They felt that, U.S. used to be the big power broker, and all of a sudden the Chinese were coming along usurping America's role. So America had to go on the offensive. And this was the reason why Biden, as much as he hated Bibi, all of a sudden was basically opening his arms to Bibi, come to Washington, and we're going to basically do this deal with Saudi Arabia. And I think it was at that point, it was obvious if this deal had gone through, that is, a U.S., Israel, Saudi deal had gone through, the biggest loser would have been Iran. No doubt about that. And the second biggest loser would have been Hamas, because the deal would have empowered the Palestinian Authority. So from that point of view, there's no question. It was just a question of when, at that point, that Iran was going to do something to sabotage, basically, this, beginning of a, normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia.
I just want to clarify a point you just said. You said that the date of 7th of October wasn't chosen by chance, right? It was a concerted effort of Iran to sabotage the Saudi Arabia-Israel peace deal. Am I correct?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, in fact, in the days leading up to basically October 7th, Khamenei himself was warning, that if these so-called moderate Sunni states were to, normalize relationship with Israel, Saudi Arabia in particular, he said that there will be a price to pay. So he was already hinting that there was something coming. So I think from that point of view, it made a lot of sense. I mean, because, and then in that sense, it was a very strategic and basically carefully calculated and calibrated move on the part of Iran to sabotage this. Because there was no doubt, I mean, if you basically come in, you send a few thousand Hamas soldiers into Israel and kill 1,000 people and did what they did, there was no doubt Israel had no choice but to reconquer Gaza or to go in, and there was no question under the circumstances that Saudi Arabia will have to back away from any rapprochement with Israel. So I think from that point of view, you could argue that this was actually very well considered, basically, move on the part of Iran.
David, I want to ask you about your area of expertise, finance and the world economy. We know that Hamas is not the only ally of Iran in the Middle East. They also have Hezbollah and the Houthis, who are now in the news because they're attacking ships going through the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, south of Israel. And it's one of the most critical straits in maritime trade. And what effect does it have on the world economy? Is the effect really as bad as they say on the news, or is that exaggerated?
I think there's no doubt it's having a major effect. And then I think the way to see this just by looking at shipping freight rates, right? If you look at basically shipping rates, freight rates for basically shipping, let's say a 40-foot basically whatever container, the cost has more or less doubled over the last basically 6 weeks, ever since the Houthi attack on Red Sea traffic basically began, right? So I think from that point of view, like if 2024 was going to be about disinflation, inflation coming down, and that interest rates are going to come down, and the stock market has been going through the roof on expectation that the Federal Reserve will be cutting interest rates, the ECB, so on and so forth, all of a sudden, in many ways, what we saw was a price shock. So if this shock becomes persistent, if basically, all these basically container, basically tankers, or have to now basically go around, Africa in order to deliver their goods from Asia to Europe or to the US, you know what? That's going to be a big problem for the global economy.
David, we all know that the American election is coming up soon in a couple months in 2024, this year. And my question to you is Biden's policy in the Middle East affected by the election? And if yes, in what way does it influence his decision making?
Right. I think this is the single most important question, because a lot of people are talking about the U.S. election and they're thinking about, oh, wow, so who's going to win? Honestly, I know who's going to win, but honestly, who's going to win doesn't really matter at this point, because that's still basically 9 months away. What is far more important is what's going to happen before the election. In particular, what is Biden going to do to salvage, what is otherwise, looks like not even going to be a race that's not even going to be competitive. Because, the starting point of any discussion about 2024 election is the fact that Biden's approval rating right now is around 37%. And in the last 80 years, no U.S. president has ever been reelected with an approval rating less than 40%. So from that point of view, there's no doubt Biden is running from behind. Now, that said, we also know that the reason why he's running from behind is because the economy, hasn't done as well as one might have thought, given that GDP growth has been pretty strong over the last basically 2 years. The reason why most Americans don't feel that they're better off since Biden becoming president is because, inflation has been generally averaging, basically at a higher rate than wage growth. So vast majority of Americans, their real purchasing power in terms of their income is actually lower now than it was at the start of the Biden presidency. And this is why Biden knows he needs the economy to work for him if he has any shot to basically catching up with Trump. Now, this is where it matters. So based on that, you say, okay, fine. So what does Biden have to do to get the economy going in 2024? Well, there's one big problem that he's having right now, which is the fact that Democrats no longer control U.S. Congress, right? They only control the Senate, but not the House. And let me tell you this, the House is determined to make sure that Biden does not avail himself of any more easy stimulus, to get the economy going, right? Because the Republicans ultimately, they want to help themselves and not help basically Biden. So Biden is not going to get any help on the fiscal side. So the only thing Biden can possibly look forward to is if the Federal Reserve starts cutting interest rates, monetary easing. But the Federal Reserve right now, the thing is this, that Jerome Powell, basically the chairman of the Federal Reserve, is not Janet Yellen. Janet Yellen was a dove, and Janet Yellen was a Democrat. I think Powell is more of a middling, Republican. He may not be a Trump supporter, but definitely he does not want to put the independence of the Federal Reserve on the table going to this election, because he understands what is at stake here. This is the most important, the most contentious election in 100 years. He does not want to basically be seen as casting the most decisive vote in this election. Now, this is the reason why Biden knows, in order to get Powell to start cutting interest rates, he needs to basically give Powell a perfect excuse to lower interest rates. And the best excuse he could possibly give him is basically a collapse in the oil price. And that's what Biden has been working towards. I mean, I'm not talking about Biden personally, but everybody around him. That's what they've been working towards the last 12 months, which is trying to bring down oil price so as to bring down inflation, and then they can basically get the Federal Reserve to cut interest rates. And they've done a whole bunch of things to bring down oil price. One of which, of course, happened last October. Biden basically announced that they will be easing sanctions on Venezuela. Another dictatorship, but apparently there's dictatorship and there's dictatorship. If you're basically oil producing dictatorship, Biden might just basically cut you some slack. So that's one thing that they did. But the single most important thing that Biden did over the last basically 15 months was the fact that they stopped enforcing the existing sanctions on Iranian oil export. You have to understand, basically as late as 2022, Iran was producing less than 200,000 barrels of oil per day. I'm talking about exporting. That's like nothing. That was basically the result of very tough sanctions imposed by the US under basically Trump. Now, Biden couldn't overturn these sanctions, but he simply stopped enforcing them. And as a result, Iranian oil export jumped by almost 1 million barrels per day over the last 12 months. Let me tell you that is worth at least $15 per barrel of oil. Okay? If the Iranian oil export were to disappear tomorrow, for example, oil price would be back at $100 a barrel, like overnight, by the way. So from that point of view, this is the most important thing, which is the fact, what we need to understand is this, that Biden to get reelected, he's being prepared to basically let Iran basically export more oil in order to drive down oil price. Now, however, this is now being used against him by Iran. Right? Because Iran now knows, okay, well, listen, there's going to be election in November. Biden is running from behind. He needs low oil price, which means that Biden does not want a regional war. So they feel that they can keep hitting the U.S. with impunity. This is why the Houthis are attacking the Red Sea. This is why, Iran-backed groups in Syria and Iraq have launched 160 attacks on U.S. positions over the past 3 months. It's because Iran is absolutely convinced that Biden cannot afford a regional war. And so far, they've been absolutely right. I mean, this is why the U.S. finally attacked the Iranian-backed groups in Syria and in Iraq basically last week. But a whole week before that, senior Iranian Revolutionary Guards were being pulled out of those countries to get out of the harm's way. Because presumably the Americans told them, oh, we're going to bomb these places, you better get your people out. Because clearly Biden does not want to go to war with Iran. So from that point of view, this is the most important thing to understand, which is this is why Iran is holding Biden hostage. And by holding Biden hostage, Iran has got the upper hand over Israel right now.
Wouldn't it be logical for Iran actually to behave in a more quiet way in the Middle East, to let Biden win? Because Biden's victory is not only contingent on the economic success, let's say, or stability, right? But also on a political support from the Muslims in America, which are a very big, significant minority in some states like Michigan, who are very critical in the American election. So wouldn't it be more logical for Iran, Houthis, and other allies and proxies of Iran to behave in a more quiet way?
No, I think, listen, again, we're 9 months before the election. Sure, I think, it's fair to assume that Iran does not want Trump to get reelected because Trump would be a disaster for Iran, okay? So from that point of view, I think when push comes to shove, if Iran has to choose between Trump and Biden, they'll choose basically Biden any day. But we're still only 9 months away from the election. It's too early for them to throw basically Biden a bone. And by the way, they cannot even be certain that basically by not doing what they're doing right now, somehow it's going to for sure guarantee that Biden is going to get reelected. So I think from that point of view, there is the strategy now versus there's a strategy for Iran, let's just say 6 months down the road. Right now, I think it makes total sense, strategically speaking, for Iran to squeeze the U.S. as hard as it can. And also because right now, what they want, ultimately what Iran wants more than anything else, is to defeat Israel. I mean, in a decisive fashion. Now, I'm not talking about to wipe out Israel, to whatever it is. If Iran can basically somehow get Biden to agree to, let's say, for example, recognize, the Palestinian state without Israeli consent, Iran would immediately declare that as a huge victory. If any ceasefire happened without Sinwar being basically, let's say, taken down, or that Israel having to basically retreat because of U.S. pressure, that would be seen as a huge victory for Iran. Because what Iran cares more than anything else is this rivalry with the Sunni states like Saudi Arabia. Iran wants to be seen in the region as the champion of the downtrodden, the champion of the oppressed. So from that point of view, Iran now has an amazing PR opportunity. I would argue up to now, from October 7th up to now, Iran has literally executed every step of the way perfectly. They have not made one false move, including the fact that actually, like the Houthis basically launched more attack this week. But what I'm saying is that they understand. I mean, this is why it's a very clever thing. And this basically begs the question, like, who in Israel understands this better than Bibi? Okay.
David, so you also have your YouTube channel and you make predictions about the future, right?
Yeah.
I want to not analyze the future, but to look at an alternative reality where in 2020 Donald Trump would win the election and that he would be the president now in the United States. How would our region, how would the Middle East look right now under Trump compared to how it's looking now under Biden?
Right. I think, first of all, I think what your audience needs to know is that, it's very funny because as much as Trump has been accused of being an anti-Semite and so on and so forth, there's nothing anti-Semitic about Trump. I mean, actually, if you think about this, like, the guy is the first U.S. president to raise 3 Orthodox grandchildren, right? I mean, basically in the White House. I mean, just crazy. But Trump definitely has a very, very, in fact, actually, if you think about this, right? The fact that his daughter married, basically Jared Kushner, that in itself is very interesting. And I think the reason is, I'll tell you, this is what it is. Trump came from a real estate family. By the way, in the 80s, when you were like in real estate, the WASPs don't go into real estate. They go into banking, they go into a lot of different things. They're going to go to real estate. The Jews were in real estate. And Donald Trump was in real estate, especially low housing real estate. And I think this is the reason why, let me tell you this, Trump was never invited to the big parties in the Hamptons or Park Avenue. He was not mingling with the sort of the white elite, if you like, in the 80s and 90s. I know a little bit about that because I went to boarding school in America back in those days with some very rich people in America. But the point here is this: Trump always felt more comfortable with the Jews. And this is why, like, I know somebody, for example, who went to actually the wedding of basically, Ivana Trump and Jared Kushner. Apparently, they were all mainly Orthodox Jews at the wedding, whatever it is. Okay, so I think this is what you need to understand. I've always felt like Trump basically was creating all these golf courses because he was looking for people to play golf with. He's not someone with lots of friends. He's someone very family-oriented. Now, if you look at Trump's approach to the Middle East, let me tell you a little bit of story here. The most important story, and again, one day somebody has to basically write this thing down. Let me tell you this. You know what people actually is funny? People forget. I don't know, even in Israel, people remember. Like, which was the very first country that Trump visited upon becoming president? Do you remember that?
Israel. It was one of the first countries.
Was Saudi Arabia. Now, which is amazing because, Trump was like, people say all sorts of things about Trump, that kind of thing. He's a racist, whatever it is. The first country he visited was Saudi Arabia. And one of the reasons was because, guess what? Shortly after Trump got elected, this is before he was even sworn in, the Saudis were desperate to get an introduction to Trump because the Saudis had really struggled under Obama, right? I don't have to tell you, Obama was anti-Sunni. Obama was all basically pro-Iran,
yeah. Pro-
Muslim Brotherhood, pro-Turkey, and so on and so forth. So from that point of view, the Saudis got very excited after Trump got elected, except, they didn't know Trump. They need an introduction. And so to make a long story short, someone I knew made an introduction, and, Mohammed bin Salman met Jared Kushner. Okay? And these two men have a lot in common. They're both young, they both come from very well-to-do families, and they were both very interested in the Middle East. And guess what? Jared Kushner set up a meeting for MBS to meet Trump at the Trump Tower just before the election. And then one thing leading to another, they were able to convince Trump to make Saudi Arabia the first country that he would visit upon coming to president. And Trump basically brought 2 messages. And then, believe me or not, like when Trump arrived in Riyadh, you can imagine. Looks like what they rolled out the red carpet because, for the king, it was like amazing. Just to think the honor they bestow on Saudi Arabia, the President of the United States made his very first foreign visit to his kingdom. So basically invited everybody who's anybody through the entire Arab world to be there. Trump brought 2 messages to basically Saudi Arabia. One, he said, you know what? We actually like you. We want to be friends with you, but you've got to take care of the extremists among you. The second thing was that, well, you got to do better for your women. And guess what? 3 weeks after Trump left, okay, basically the Saudis swooped in and basically arrested the 20 leading radical clerics and put them basically behind bars. Okay? 3 months after that, they reopened the cinemas that had been closed since the 1980s. Okay? 3 months after that, women were allowed to drive. Okay? And then shortly after that, Mohammed bin Salman was made the new crown prince. So from that point of view, this is what you need to understand, which is that because in the end, what this comes down to is this, okay? Because of Trump, Mohammed bin Salman is now in the driver's seat. And this guy is the most important reformer in Saudi Arabia, basically in the last 100 years. And this guy wants to basically westernize Saudi Arabia. And therefore, for the first time, Israel actually has a partner for peace. And that was the reason why. And because at the end of the day, we can sit here and talk about why Iran is so bad, why is arch enemy number one. Because Iran is still stuck in the medieval mindset. They are totally religious. They believe in the destruction of Israel because they see everything in a religious light. This is why they've done poorly when it comes to economy, technology, everything. I mean, the country is very backward, okay? Whereas
they're also under sanctions.
They're under sanctions, but you know what? The point, but they brought it up. They brought it upon themselves. But my point here is that Saudi Arabia, UAE, these countries are actually going places. And I think from that point of view, Trump's vision was that, well, you know, listen, it makes a lot of sense that these countries, their enemy is Iran. Israel's enemy is Iran. It's basically Iran because they want to basically, you know, they want to develop a nuclear weapon, which will basically set up a whole arms race. Why don't we get them to basically talk to each other? And that's what actually happened. Because at the end of the day, Saudi Arabia at this point, I mean, Mohammed bin Salman understands, like, you know, Saudi Arabia needs to reinvent itself if it is to have a future. And it cannot just be an oil play, a one-trick pony. So therefore, it needs to basically develop a diversified economy and technology and so on and so forth. And Israel is a natural partner. So from that point of view, Trump being a businessman was able to basically see right away that basically that, you know, Israel and the modern Arab states have business in common. And that's what, you know, and that became the new platform where people can actually talk to each other. That changes everything.
David, unfortunately, we're running out of time. Yes. We have to finish our interview. Yes. We'll do another interview on the geopolitical future of Israel. But for now, I want to say thank you for sharing your wisdom and your insight into American politics and into the world politics. It's been a pleasure. I want to also thank all of our viewers that saw this interview. Please don't forget to subscribe to us on all our social media platforms and here on YouTube. Thank you again. Have a great day.